Over the last few lessons, we've been spending time looking at the various different elements of conservatism as part of the A-level political ideas syllabus for AQA. This video is going to talk a little bit more about conservatism, but moving and shifting a little bit more into modern conceptualizations of conservatism. This being described sometimes as the new right in terms of conservatism. We'll also talk about other variations of conservatism in future lessons' time as well. We'll talk about modern conservatism as referred to as this idea of there being the new right. We're going to talk a little bit about the origins of this idea, specifically in the writings of people, for example, such as Ayn Rand. And then we will also focus a little bit about what the new conservative, the new right, actually believes in relation to economic policy, foreign policy, the extent of the requirement of government intervention in the day-to-day lives of individuals. This idea of there being a vehement response against this idea of big government, for example, or government which has a lot of control over the lives of individuals. So this variation of conservatism, the idea of the new right, has its inspiration in the works of Ayn Rand and their idea of the morality of the rational self-interest. Now, the rational self-interest essentially implies the thing that I just mentioned, that one of the things that the new right shifts its attention towards, the idea of modern conservatism today, it shifts its idea and attention towards there being a lack of the need for a state in terms of intervening in the lives of individuals. It's not anarchistic in the sense that there is a lack of the requirement of the state in its entirety, but that what should be the case is that because of there is the fact that all human beings have a rational self-interest, and that there is a certain amount of morality inscribed in the rational self-interest, taking the phrase of Ayn Rand to the words that they are actually describing. But the state should be limited in terms of the number of things that it should be concerned in doing. It should not be concerned in doing the regulation and the intervention of regulation in the social life of individuals, for example, or even it should have very little regulation in the economic life of individuals. In order for the successful implementation of rational self-interest, the influence of the state should be as limited as possible. So what Ayn Rand does, and what modern conservatism sort of perceives in this review, is this idea that as the rational self-interest should be the front and center of our considerations, this can only be achieved when we have the limitation of the state. The state fundamentally hampers the ability for the flourishing of the rational self-interest. And so these sort of exist as a kind of yin and yang, if you will. There is the need and there is a desire for there to be the successful implementation of the rational self-interest, and in order for this to take place, the influence of the state must be as limited as it could possibly be. And so really, what does the state have a responsibility to do in the view of the modern conservative? Well, the state should be responsible for the most basic aspects of life, and some of the things that are required by the state, that only the state could essentially involve itself in doing. For example, providing armed forces. Individuals and societies and social groups can't really provide armed forces, and so it is the responsibility of the state to do that kind of thing. To provide police forces, should I say, which essentially attempt to keep the peace in not so many words, and fundamentally provide law and order. Again, another thing that can't really be achieved in the day-to-day lives of ordinary people. And they also, as a result of this, should have the responsibility of maintaining a judicial system, a system of legal adjudication, for there to be cases that can be brought, for those people who have been charged with crimes to be punished for those crimes, or to be put on trial for those crimes, etc., etc., etc. All of the most basic aspects of our lives, the most fundamental bare bones responsibilities. These aspects fundamentally are necessary to maintain a number of different things, including, as the classical liberal would essentially attest to, the protection of basic property rights. There is the opposition to public spending on things like welfare. So things like the welfare state, things like social policy, social regulation, a lot of the quite intensive and quite intrusive economic policies, such as quite high taxation. All of these kinds of things ought to be put to the wayside. Okay, there shouldn't be public spending on things like welfare. There should only be public spending on things that are the most necessary for the state to have to provide, such as armed forces, police, and judiciary. The philosopher, one of the modern philosophers, who wrote the book Anarchy, State, and Utopia, who disagrees quite a lot with John Rawls, Robert Nozick, argues that the existence of a welfare state creates a state of dependency, that people become dependent on the welfare state. If you have a welfare state there that you can rely on at any point in any circumstances of life, then you will not feel the need to try and break away from the need for a welfare state, and so the result of that is you become dependent upon it. With all this in mind, therefore, how does the modern conservative conceptualize economic policy? Well, as you would probably understand, economic policy is enshrined in this view of free market capitalism. The New Right believes that the free market is the best way to regulate the appropriation of and allocation of resources. And so the result of this is that in order to protect this free market as far as humanly possible, the New Right advocates for the promotion of the free market in economic policy. This involves a cut in taxation, privatization of all industry, deregulation of said industries. The state should not be involved in the economic activities of industry, of firms. So firms should be in the hands of private corporations. They should be deregulated so far as humanly possible, and there should be limited taxation. Limited taxation only for the things that we require, only for the things that the state requires, okay? So things like, for example, the maintenance of police, the maintenance of armed forces. Those kinds of things that the state has to essentially regulate are the only things that taxation should be used for. In terms of social policy and the social structure, there is much division, in fact, among the New Right between concepts such as neoconservatism and neoliberalism. Now, the New Right is a sort of all-encompassing phrase, okay? For the most part, we would probably describe neoliberalism as an inherent part of New Right conservatism, or at least as part of the New Right, or at least part of a more modern conceptualization of conservative movements. Neoliberals tend to be more conservative in today's common parlance. But there is also this view of neoconservatism, which is sort of enshrined and linked into the view of neoliberalism and the New Right. All of these things are a little bit difficult to unpack at different points. Everybody has various different views and understandings of their own political philosophies, and so the result of this is all of these ideas sort of get mixed in together. There is one division, though, that we can really clearly delineate between neoconservatism and neoliberalism. On the one hand, neoconservatism rejects the concept of the permissiveness, which advocates for the ability for people to make their own moral choices, that there is this sort of moral freedom that exists, okay? They believe instead that the state ought to impose order and to impose public morality. It is part of the state's mandate to ensure that public morality is adhered to. Now, what a neoconservative believes is what is moral is obviously a number of quite conservative ideas, quite socially conservative ideas. These tend to be quite heavily infused in religious ideology, so things like Christian classical or at least Christian traditional views of morality, which of course would strike and be quite in opposition to a number of views of public morality that we think of today. So, for example, in cases such as abortion and marriage rights, there tends to be quite extensive opposition to the right of an abortion, or the right of things like same-sex marriage, for example, because of course these are quite conservative public morals, and so conservative views on social issues such as abortion and marriage rights tend to be quite anti-same-sex marriage, tend to be quite pro-life, for example. This is not to suggest that all neoconservatives are pro-life and anti-same-sex marriage. Obviously, you have varying degrees of morality and thought processes throughout morality in terms of these ideas. It just tends to be, on the whole, the case that this is true. Again, and as I've mentioned, there is often the promotion of traditional values, often with religious connotations ascribed to them. On the other hand, neoliberalism doesn't believe that the state should intervene in individual choices. Instead, lack of intervention extends from the social to the economic. Okay, there should be this in the same way, in a similar sense, that there is a lack of intervention in the economy, that the state should deregulate. It should be reductive in terms of taxation. It should be quite pro-privatization. In the same way that it is quite extensive in terms of economic, lack of intervention in terms of the economic side of state policy, it should also do the same for social policy. It should be very very lax in terms of its interventionist ideas in terms of social political ideas.